Welcome to the final day of the Future of the American Child journalism training here in Charlotte. We have had 3 days of really intensive conversations about the systemic barriers to child and family well-being. Today, we're going to focus on how to build that relationship with local organizations who are at the forefront of trying to address systemic barriers and challenges for all families, but certainly for low-income families, families who are striving to do the best for their children. If you recall, I told you earlier this week that I lived in Charlotte for 3 years, from 2016 to 2019, and this was after I had spent a decade on the African continent reporting or helping reporters cover health issues. And one of the journalists whose work stood out for me as I would read local media and consume local media was Eli Portillo. At the time, he worked for the Charlotte Observer. And he covered from my perspective, particularly coming from the African continent and focusing on development and socioeconomic issues, he covered quite a few of those kinds of things in communities around Charlotte. So his work stood out for me. And so when I started to begin covering or organizing this event, a story of his popped up called the Childcare Crunch. I believe I forwarded that to all of you. He wrote it for the Charlotte Ledger. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, and that's something I'd love if we have time for you to talk about.
Yeah.
Charlotte Ledger is a Substack. How many of you know what Substacks are? It's a Substack publication that covers local news. It's really part of the whole initiative to support local news in different formats across the country. And so he wrote that story, and I realized that even though he is now the senior editor for news and planning for WFAE Radio, the NPR station here in Charlotte, he still very much has his finger on the pulse of these kinds of issues, child well-being, family well-being, and covering this in the Charlotte and North Carolina region. And as he told me about that story, his reporting on that story, he told me that one of the people who he has depended on locally through the years to help advise and inform him about child well-being, child care in the state and beyond is Janet Singerman. And Janet is the president and CEO of Childcare Resources Incorporated. So I thought this would be a good opportunity for us to not only learn from Eli, to learn about his thoughts on how journalists can confront this issue and report on this issue, but then also to have them both model for you how to best mine this relationship with people who are at the forefront of these issues. So we're going to start with Eli, and Janet will follow, and then we'll have a good conversation about this relationship. So Eli.
All right. Thank you for the introduction.
You're welcome.
And do I have slides up here? Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for the great introduction. I'm Eli Portillo, and actually, since we talked a few weeks ago, I have a new title now, so I had to update it there. It's Interim News Director. So,
cool.
You know, if you stick around long enough in local journalism, you just kind of move up by default, as I'm sure many of you know. So, yeah. I appreciate you all coming to Charlotte. And I will be pretty quick with this presentation because I understand it's day 4. And I've been to programs like this, and I know after 4 days in a Hyatt event room, you're probably like, you know, this guy better not have more than like 4 slides. So I will try to keep it quick, and then we can get into some dialogue. So I've spent most of my career in Charlotte. I started off with some internships in Miami, DC, Fresno, California, but then I moved here in 2009 and for a job at the Charlotte Observer. Ended up spending most of 10 years at the Observer covering growth and development. So I kind of focused on transit, real estate, housing, and through all that came to economic inequality, which I think you've heard a lot about in Charlotte, but has been a really persistent issue here. So I was a reporter covering those issues, and then in, gosh, I gotta think now, 2018, I had my first kid, and my wife and I suddenly realized that childcare was going to be the most difficult part of this whole thing. We were fortunate not to have any bigger complications or anything, but we were shocked, and I was personally shocked at how difficult and expensive it was to get childcare. So, oh, this thing buzzes when you hit next. That's exciting. Sorry. So in 2019, I left the Charlotte Observer and went to UNC Charlotte's Urban Institute, which is like an in-house think tank, not the DC Urban Institute, although they were founded in the same year and have the same name, so lots of brand confusion there. And while I was there, I continued freelancing for local publications, including the Charlotte Ledger there, and wrote that story on the left. And then, or no, that was Axios Charlotte, Axios Local, and then the Charlotte Ledger is the one in the middle. And then in 2022, I came to WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, and I am now an editor who assigns and edits coverage of these issues. So that story on the right is a story that we just published in December, I think, with one of our reporters here. So I'm just going to talk about how I approach covering these issues and then how I have worked with Janet. And then I would love to, like I said, have some dialogue after Janet's presentation. So, to kick it off, I just wanted to get your thoughts really quickly on what childcare is a story about. So when you see that, childcare is a story about ... fill in the blank, what do you think? And there are no wrong answers, only bad ones. So. Yes?
Keeping parents in the workforce.
Keeping parents in the workforce, yeah. What else?
Healthcare.
Healthcare, okay. Mm-hmm. Especially post-pandemic, I think we've seen a lot of that. One more?
I mean, the overall labor market availability in a region.
Yes, labor market availability, similar to that, yeah. So my big fear in writing about childcare, which I've been doing here in Charlotte, I was thinking back yesterday, I was like, man, that's been 5 years. I've written a bunch of these stories. My big fear in writing about this is that childcare often turns into a story about the same old, same old. You know, I was looking back at the stories that I think Rachel shared with you in 2018, 19 when I started writing about this, and in a lot of ways it feels like the only thing that's changed is the numbers, which are worse in a lot of ways. So in thinking about this, I was like, what are some different lenses for how to approach local childcare or national childcare coverage besides just, frankly, the same old story of like, gee, it's really expensive, or man, those wait lists are crazy, which you've probably heard. If you're a parent, you've probably experienced. So one lens that I've been approaching childcare coverage with is the first one that both of y'all mentioned, which is childcare is a story about economic development. It has really become apparent, especially post-COVID, when childcare was scarce, even scarcer than usual, and really difficult to find, that childcare is a major limiting factor for many parents' involvement in the workforce. And beyond involvement in the workforce, it is also a major limiting factor for many people's economic mobility. This is from a 2022 study by the North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation, which found that about 400,000 working parents across the state of North Carolina are constrained by childcare needs. That's somewhere around 8% of the workforce, which is not insignificant. And this includes parents who defer work opportunities, defer training opportunities, pass on credentials and skills that they could accumulate if they were able to attend but are simply not because of the lack of childcare. So it's more than just can they work or not, it's a broad spectrum. So this is a major factor in many states in terms of labor market availability and people's ability to get ahead economically. Childcare, I believe, is a story about equity, racial, gender, socioeconomic. Any lens that you look through, childcare is a major factor in whether people have access not just to economic betterment, but opportunity for their children. Have you guys heard about the crescent and wedge in Charlotte and the divide? Okay, wow. You made it 4 days in Charlotte and nobody has used the words crescent and wedge? That is shocking. Okay, well, we can change that. So this is a map of Charlotte by race. This is from an online tool called the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Quality of Life Explorer. It's a joint project of the City of Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, and the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute, my old employer. And it is basically a project to visualize geospatial data about a bunch of different factors. So it has everything from like water usage to education level to student absenteeism. So it's a great tool. If your locality has something like this, I would encourage you to mine it for story ideas because I've done that a lot. But this is a map of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County. And down here, we call this the wedge locally. Janet, you've probably heard this like ad nauseum. Up there are some towns in the north by the lake that also are whiter and wealthier on average. And we call this the crescent. So this is a major factor in Charlotte's segregation. These areas, neighborhoods have historically been redlined, underinvested in, are mostly Black and Latino. And some of them have down to low single digits white folks. These neighborhoods have historically been redlined the opposite way with restrictive deed covenants that is carried through. And these are up to 97% white, some of these census tracts. So Charlotte is very racially segregated. And when you look at household wealth and income, you see a very similar pattern. So that's race. That's income. Now, education. This is the percentage of people aged 25 or older with a bachelor's degree in Charlotte. It's almost the same map as these other two, reflects the same patterns. And then the farthest we can back it up with this tool, oops, wrong way, is elementary school test proficiency. And this is 3rd through 5th grade percentage of students who are test proficient. It really nosedived after COVID. It used to be around 50%. Now it's like 35% countywide. So that's a whole different issue. But I suspect if you backed this up to children who attended a high quality early childhood education program, you would see a very similar distribution. And this shows how this issue really carries through and really correlates to race and economics as well. So I know I said this is a very good tool. I like this tool a lot, but when you look at it, it also kind of all the maps look like this because they all reflect the same underlying factors. But that's another lens that I've been approaching local childcare stories through. And the third major lens, I think, is childcare is a story about the workforce and workers' rights. Janet will talk more about this, but childcare workers are consistently the lowest, often the very lowest paid among professions that require any sort of qualifications or expertise. And the workforce in childcare is largely dominated by women and women of color who are doing some of the most important work and the hardest work, but receiving poverty or near poverty wages. So as the labor movement has really picked up steam again over the past few years in the United States with a lot more successful pushes to organize, pushes to get better working conditions in everyone from Amazon to Hollywood writers, this is another area of great inequality in the workforce and in the workers' rights sphere. This is the Center for American Progress 2022. Despite the integral role that early childhood educators play, they are compensated with low to poverty wages for their work. And every time I have to spend, all day unplanned with my 5 and 3-year-old, I'm like, man, these people need to make $1 million because there's not enough money in the world. So reporting on these issues over the past few years, Janet and I have, I think, formed a good working relationship. She has been a great bridge to me, connecting me with childcare centers, childcare workers, and reporters I've worked with, connecting them, and really helping us go beyond the anecdotal to the great data that she and her colleagues collect and make available. So I'll stop talking and let Janet talk more, and then we'll come back and talk more about whatever. So, oh yeah, thanks. You can follow me on X if that's your thing. I get no engagement there anymore since I lost my blue check, so I would love if you would retweet me. Or I am also always easy to get on email too. So I will shut up now and let Janet talk.
Well, thanks, Eli. I'm not sure what I have to say. You've done it all.
All right, well, come on, sit down and call it a day.
I can sit down and have a conversation. But in any case, thanks very much for inviting me here today to talk about childcare. It's an issue that I've committed most of my career to. And I've had the honor and privilege of leading childcare resources for the past 26 years. So in that time, I've had lots of conversations with the media, with the press, and I gotta say, it still makes me very nervous to have this conversation. But one of the highlights is really the kind of work that Eli and I have done together over time to sort of bring forward in recognizable bits the issues impacting childcare in Mecklenburg County, in North Carolina, and across the country. And just to give you a sense, where is that?
Oh, it's on the front.
There it is, thank you,
Yes.
sorry. We work to ensure that families and communities and children have access to high quality early learning opportunities and experiences that enable them to succeed in school and in life. And much of the work that we do is really, while critically important, is really behind the scenes. We work with educating parents about what to look for and the importance of quality early care and education. We work to build the capacity of the childcare workforce by delivering training and technical assistance to support quality instruction and childcare delivery. We help low-income working families afford the cost of childcare. We administer about $94 million in childcare subsidy funds, which enable low-income families to work, and their children to benefit from high-quality early care and education. We also work to educate the public and private sector and journalists about childcare, and we also advocate for needed system improvements. So we sort of are what's known as a childcare resource and referral agency. These are our core functions. We work across the community in many different ways, directly and indirectly, to advance the quality of childcare in the regions that we serve. We are active at a local level, a regional level, and a statewide level, with about 112 staff and an operating budget of about $19 million. But I guess what I want to say is that childcare resources has always been focused on opportunity for 2 or more generations. We focus on the parent, we focus on the child, and we focus on the adult that the child will become. So really this work in early care and education is multi-generational, short-term and long-term. And so to set the stage, I wanted to share with you some of the demographics. I'm going to talk to you about childcare in Mecklenburg and North Carolina, and through that, the issues that we're facing. So here's some data, and you'll have this, I guess, Rachel, in the handouts that you'll get. But you can get a sense of our child population, which is just under 90,000. The majority of households with children under the 6, 70% in Mecklenburg and just slightly fewer in North Carolina, are households in which all parents present are working. So So if all parents present are working, childcare is an issue for these families, whether it's formal childcare, informal childcare. We have a licensed childcare market of just over 500 programs, and they are predominantly, based on North Carolina's licensing standards, higher quality programs. Our market is predominantly a 4- and 5-star market. We have a 1- to 5-star system. 1 is meeting basic licensing regulations, and in North Carolina, at our floor, our regulations are about the second worst in the country. But most of our children are in 4- and 5-star care. That's where most of the market, we've moved most of the market to. But the cost of care is significant. As Eli said, cost of care is pretty high. For an infant, what is that number you've been paying for?
Oh gosh, like between my 2 kids right now, our cost of childcare is about $2,200, which was with a discount a month. And I mean, that's lower than some larger cities, but for perspective, our housing costs are also lower, et cetera, in Charlotte. So we pay more for childcare than we do for our house and our cars. It's by far, put together, it's by far our number one monthly expense.
And you're going to see that infant care is over $15,000 a year, ranging up to 4-year-old care, which is about $13,500 a year, expensive for a household. We have a fairly abundant supply when open, not abundant, but adequate supply when open. And if you saw Eli's maps, you see that childcare is concentrated pretty much in the area where we have both low-income families and middle-income families. And you saw up north where he said it was fairly affluent, not as much supply up north. People making different kinds of childcare arrangements, but also population driving less abundance of childcare in those areas. But if you see the middle of of Charlotte and the southern tip of Charlotte, you see fairly significant childcare supply, and we have this mapped up on our website if you ever want to go see it. We have the star ratings, type of care, et cetera. So we're a treasure trove of information. I guess that's one point. Find out who has the data in your community about childcare. And in Mecklenburg County and across the state, we manage the statewide database of all regulated childcare here and across the state. And so we've got lots of data that we're constantly mining, and we're anxious to share it.
Yes, it saved me countless hours. I mean, literally, it would take me as a journalist dozens of hours to get the data and parse it the way you've done, if I could even do it. So number one thing is find out who's got the numbers, because someone probably already has them.
And that's what childcare looks like across the state of North Carolina. So again, Western North Carolina, fairly rural. Where you see less supply, it's because it's rural areas. And there is another story in the childcare landscape, which is about rural childcare versus urban childcare. And there are really differences between the two in terms of the conditions of those markets and the resources available to those markets. So if you're thinking about a childcare story, think about what's urban, what's rural, and where are the differences. And there are some different stories to be told there. So I guess going back, oops, nope. Now you know what I'm going to say. Suffice it to say that childcare is an issue that impacts the majority of households with young children in Mecklenburg County, in North Carolina, clearly across the nation. And while you're gathered here to talk about the American child and the future of the American child, childcare is an issue that impacts both children and parents, and more specifically and disproportionately, let's be real, mothers and other caregivers. And access to childcare significantly and also disproportionately impacts women's employment and their earnings, because, you know it, there are a lot of women in this room. When a woman has a child, everything changes, right? In addition to becoming a mother, suddenly her access to income depends on others. It depends on having someone else in their home who can go to work, or having someone else, either in or outside of the home, who can provide childcare so she can go to work. And while some mothers have access to relatives or friends who can provide loving and nurturing and wonderful and safe care, other families need licensed childcare programs to provide this support. So why do we worry so much about the quality of childcare for young children? And that's that Jim Heckman slide. Because all the research tells us that what happens in the first 5 years, and in particular the first 3 years of life, has a profound impact on the child's trajectory throughout life. And also, his research has proven that investment in early care and education has an unparalleled return versus investment in strategies to remediate later in life. This is pretty well-known stuff, right? You've seen all of Heckman's work, I hope, and if you haven't, he has a wonderful website. But building and sustaining a high-quality childcare system is no simple matter, and as you are already aware, childcare throughout the United States is incredibly underfinanced because parents are in their early earning years when their children are in their early learning years. And the family budget has to cover basics, right? Like housing, food, and transportation, medical care, clothing, all those basics. And with the birth of a child, it has to stretch even farther to cover the cost of childcare. And this puts families in even greater financial squeeze. In North Carolina, parents' fees pay for, and so here's that data, just to give you a sense. Average center-based infant care, just nearly $16,000. Think about that. In Mecklenburg, we're higher than the rest of the state. We're urban. But it's more than double the cost of tuition at UNCC, at UNC Chapel Hill. And think about it. When you have a young child, you're at a much earlier stage in your earnings, right? You can save for college, right? But as an actual cost, dollars, and as a percentage of household income, we expect young families to shoulder the full cost of childcare in order to work. As an actual number and as a percentage of household income, the burden is left to families to afford the cost of childcare much more so than K-12 education and higher education. And so just like Eli said, 2 children in care, average annual mortgage payment, just under $20,000 a year. It's a real financial crunch for families. It struggles. So at the same time, childcare is really expensive to operate. So who knows why?
You need very high staffing ratios.
Right, labor. It's all about the labor costs. It's an intensive industry. Personnel costs are about 60 to 80% of any childcare program operating budget. And given the limited budgets of young families, childcare program operators can't afford to pay higher salaries for their staff, even high salaries, even median wage salaries for their staff. As a result, the wages and the education levels of our workforce are really low. Turnover is high, impacting a workforce that is disproportionately women of color. And in Mecklenburg County, depending on the position you hold, 45 to 73% of our childcare workforce are women of color. So childcare teachers, as Eli said, can now work more and earn more at fast food restaurants, at call centers, at big box stores than they can by caring and nurturing and teaching our young children. In an article that appeared just yesterday, it was quoted that Costco is paying $17 an hour, Verizon is paying $20 an hour, and the median childcare worker salary in North Carolina is about $21,450 a year. In Mecklenburg County, with pandemic funding supports, we're paying about $15 to $16 an hour. Not as much as Costco, not as much as McDonald's, not as much as Verizon.
And people throw up on you a lot less at Costco.
They do. They do, and this I neglected to show is just fees as a percentage of median household income. So you can see families under 18, married couple with children under 18, single female, single male. The range is 15% to 10%, high percentages. And we talked nationally for years. There was a U.S. Department of Labor standard that said no household should pay more than 10% of their gross family income on childcare. Now there's federal discussion about, for subsidized care, no family paying more than 7% copayment for the cost of care. But clearly, the cost of care has outstripped affordability for many families. So who's paying for childcare in North Carolina? Predominantly parents. But about 32% of the cost of care fees paid for childcare are paid through childcare subsidies like those that we administer in Mecklenburg County. So every day, because of this, about 1/3 of our childcare workforce uses or needs some form of public assistance, and about half have no employer-sponsored health insurance. So we're talking about poor wages and inadequate benefits and a pretty fragile existence. And I don't know if you've stepped into childcare lately, but when you're in childcare, how many times did your children get ill, or did you get ill in that first year in childcare?
I mean, gosh, I think last year, which is not even our first year, we probably had like 8 episodes of illness in our house.
That's because whenever young children are together, whenever children are together, they're sharing germs, and those germs spread to those who care for children and their families, and we have no health insurance. We have no organized health insurance program for our child care workforce. So every day in North Carolina and elsewhere, we're losing educated and experienced early educators to other jobs which require less education and less responsibility. In North Carolina thus far, we seem to be retaining more of our senior staff. We have lost much of our mid-level staff in childcare, and we've got more new staff than ever before, and they tend to be less educated and less experienced. So what does that mean for the childcare system to come to? Because we've lost that mid-group that's kind of moving up, and we have lots and lots and lots of new classroom staff. So lots of challenges. So the catch-22 of childcare is that families can't afford to pay more, teachers can't afford to earn less, and in fact don't even earn a living wage, and childcare programs can't charge more and stay in business. Moreover, I guess what I want to show, these are, I'm sorry, I'm not keeping up with my slides, but these are sort of relative wages of child services, schools, restaurants, family services, medical services, et cetera. And you see childcare is pretty much at the low end. And this is dated, so I think it's probably changed a bit since this was
And these are North Carolina
crafted.
numbers, right?
Yeah, North Carolina. So what's happened also in North Carolina is that state funding for childcare, which is the blue line, is flat over the past 10 years. Well, what happened 10 years ago, Eli?
The Chetty study?
No?
It was 2014. I was still in my 20s.
Okay, I'll tell you.
I don't know.
Our legislature shifted from 100 years of Democrat control to a majority and then supermajority on the other side of the House, on the other side of the aisle.
10 years was the supermajority, not the first shift. Yeah,
the first shift was about 12 years ago.
Yeah.
So that has happened. Up until that point, early childhood education was, had an unparalleled level of investment when Governor Hunt started our Smart Start program, which is a birth to 5 program that focuses on the school readiness of young children, investing in child care and child health and in family support. We had a change in legislative leadership, and since then we've been flat. Now, the gray line is higher education. It's not done much better, been fairly flat until lately, but the brown line is K-12 education. So of all these systems of education, I want to say that childcare is early education. This is the one that's funded at the lowest level and has remained absolutely flat over the past more than a decade. Despite all these challenges, there's a pandemic story to tell. And childcare in North Carolina as a system never shut down. Programs remained open with increased operating costs and widely fluctuating enrollment, and overall reduced enrollment. And childcare, good news is, childcare became recognized as an essential service, and childcare staff were heralded as heroes because while the schools closed in North Carolina, childcare never closed in North Carolina because it was perceived to be an essential service for those who needed to continue to work to keep our economy and our services going. So while we feared huge childcare permanent closures in North Carolina and across in Charlotte and in North Carolina, really across the nation, thus far here that hasn't happened. And that's largely because the federal government stepped in and provided $24 billion across nationally in emergency funding as part of the American Rescue Plan. And so here are the rescue plan dollars that North Carolina received. In total, about $1.76 million. And the largest share of the rescue funds were from the largest share of federal funding that we received during the pandemic was from ARPA. And those funds were used really to stabilize the industry. The state provided 2 different kinds of grants, one to offset fixed operating costs, and the other to address compensation. So while we were having a workforce shortage overall, and people weren't coming back to work, and wages were rising, and childcare wages were flat, and we were losing staff, the state created a program to supplement childcare workers' compensation. And that has been very, very successful in stabilizing the industry thus far. So here are the grants that were put out and the spread of grants and stabilization grants. Mecklenburg County statewide, just under, $1 billion. And in Mecklenburg County, we had about 1/10 of that, just over 1/10 of that, funds that kept our programs alive and impacted jobs and impacted the availability of childcare. But as you probably have followed in the paper, those stabilization, that federal grant funding, new funding, ended in October 1. North Carolina still had some money left over, and so our advocacy was focused on, here are the results. So North Carolina, changes in our market are pretty minimal, right? You see that we had pretty minimal childcare programs. We're down 203 programs, but only 5 childcare centers. The rest are family childcare homes. These are women who provide childcare in their own homes, licensed by the state. And there's a whole story to tell about that, but it's another day to tell that story. So from a childcare center market where most of the children in North Carolina are served, very stable. In Mecklenburg County, the same thing. We had growth, actually. We've actually had growth in the number of childcare centers, but we have also had shrinkage in the number of family childcare homes. And we could have that story, the conversation further. So what's going to happen now is here's the $1.3 billion that we had from ARPA monies and COVID and CARES Act monies, down to an annual typical federal investment of about $400 million. And so that's the funding cliff. When you talk about the funding cliff all over the country, this is what we're talking about. How do you go from an underfinanced system to begin with to a system that has increased operating costs, increased staffing costs? Wage inflation has been rampant, and it hasn't, tapped back down post-pandemic. We're going to lose all of this funding. We're going to be trying to survive with the $400 million that we had prior to the pandemic. That's the crisis that we're in right now. And you've probably seen the Century Foundation's report that projects massive changes in terms of the impact of childcare program closures. And whether you agree with these numbers or not, there will be an impact. So it may not be as massive. We've certainly not seen this yet, but the impact is going to be fairly significant, both in terms of child slots, the jobs lost in the childcare industry, the revenue lost by business because of worker productivity, the tax revenue base that will be impacted, et cetera. So Century Fund has put out these fairly huge numbers. We haven't seen it yet, but that's really what's at stake here and elsewhere all across the country. So they project just over 155,000 slots, nearly 1,800 child care programs in North Carolina will close, 416 million losses in earnings, $485 million in lost productivity, $19 million loss in state income tax revenue, and just under 6,000 child care jobs lost. So that's what's at stake. And the question is really what happens next. And this is where I'm so appreciative. I have to say, and you can probably tell, this is the room that I'm most nervous. You are the people I'm most nervous talking to. It helps for it to be in 3D and face-to-face. But what really is important is the relationships that we develop with you, because when we have that relationship, we can get past the awkwardness, perhaps, of the question or the tentativeness of the response to really drill down deep to what's the story behind the story. And Eli does that, so amazingly well. So what happens next is really the question. We've advocated in the last General Assembly session unsuccessfully for $300 million more to keep stabilization grants going. There was bipartisan support. The legislation didn't make it into the budget, and the state told the department to use some discretionary ARPA remaining dollars to keep stabilization grants going through June, but that's kicking, the can. So we're just, instead of crashing in December, we stand to crash in July. And so we have a short session coming up. We're working towards our advocacy agenda for that short session, but a lot is at stake. I've always worked in a bipartisan manner across the aisle. I mean, I once testified before the Senate at the invitation of Senator Richard Brewer, and I'm a lifelong D. So it's really important that childcare is seen as a bipartisan issue. It is a bipartisan issue. That is the way we work with our advocacy. But the language we use is really important, and I struggle with this when I'm talking to any of you about what's the right language to use to convey the urgency of the situation in a way that can be heard and received as important by a wide array of political and individual perspectives. So as an example, I know when I call for childcare investment as a public good, that will turn off as many people as it might excite. But what's the right language to use? And if any of you have it, I'm all ears, because we really have a system that has never invested fully in the ability of women to work, for them to be paid commensurately, for their family needs to be addressed, and for the workforce behind the workforce, which is childcare, to be appropriately funded so that it can not just survive, but thrive and be what it could be and is in other nations. So in the 1980s, I started my work, and my early work in this field was with employers on work-family policy development. And here I am so much later in my career, and I feel like in some regards I'm back in the 1980s because the situation is somewhat similar. In the 80s, there was a big Workforce 2000 report by Hudson Institute that called for a workforce shortage. As a result of that, there was an increased focus on attracting and retaining folks who were locked out of the workforce or not welcome into the workforce. Well, here we are again. We have a significant workforce shortage. We have population trends that are declining, and I think we have to pay attention to those population trends. Employers are beginning to feel the pinch, not being able to fill positions. I know there are staffing issues in every industry. There are staffing issues in childcare because everyone's leaving to go to better paid jobs. So it's a time and a window, and I think Eli spoke to it. I look for what are the levers to pull. When the Chetty study came out, that said Charlotte was the 50th of 50 cities in terms of economic and social mobility. If you were born poor in Charlotte, you were going to die poor in Charlotte. And the community was shamed and was really looking for how could we move this, how could we change this trajectory, and is still wrestling with that. And I went to the Opportunity Task Force and I said, childcare has to be part of your strategy. Early education has to be part of your strategy. And from that, their first strategic imperative was investing in early education. We went to the county and talked about the same things and talked about the needs. We had a waiting list for childcare subsidy in Mecklenburg County historically of about 5,000 children. We got $20 million for childcare subsidy. We talked about the importance of public pre-K. There is now a county-funded public pre-K program. We talked about the importance of the workforce pipeline, which we haven't addressed fully yet because of wages, but those wages are better in public pre-K and in elementary school than they are in childcare. And so we have workforce strategies, all of which the county is funding. So we have federal funding through the Childcare and Development Block Grant working in this area. We have state funding to some degree. We also have county funding that is supporting really the advancement of children's access to high quality early education in our midst. So I think now is another time to pull a lever, and it's the employer level. And so increasingly, I'm talking to folks from the Chamber of Commerce at the state level, the national level, and the local level, presenting to Carolina's Regional Council, which is our Economic Development Council, talking to the workforce development folks. It's a new window, and it's a new lever. And I talk about it not to devalue its importance. I think when you have these opportunities and you have these issues, you try and figure, how do I reframe? What lever do I pull, and who can I connect to who has more influence than I do as an advocate standing before a group? And so that's when relationships like ours with Eli, with reporters on his staff, with reporters across the community are so important, because I can only say so much and I can only say it so well. I look to you because you have the wonderful opportunity to influence, wonderful opportunity to articulate in an unbiased way what the real story is. And so however we can help you with that real story, however these relationships can help, I encourage you to craft them in the communities that you serve. Thank you.
For somebody who was nervous about speaking to me, you crushed it. So let's open it up. Do any of you have any questions for Janet or Eli?
Hi, I'm Marissa from Good Housekeeping. A common reaction I see to stories about childcare or even programs like free lunch is people who say, like, well, I chose not to have kids, or my kids are grown, why should I pay for your kids? Have you found like a way in to make people who are not the parents of young children care about these issues?
I think for as many parents who don't have young children, there are parents who work beside them or who assist them and support them who are impacted by this issue. So I think it's tough. And we've had mommy wars in this country for as long as I've been alive. But I think it is this issue that this is about really more than, it is about the individual child and the individual family, but it's really also about how do we have a robust workforce, whether we have a child or not, and what's necessary, what are the barriers that we should be able to remove to all folks' employment so that we really can have the kind of robust economy and workforce that we need. But there will always be someone who will say that.
Yeah, I think to me it's kind of a similar question to what you get into with things around student loan repayments, and I know a lot of folks are like, well, I paid my student loan, so why should I have to change? I think that's just going to happen whenever you have anything that benefits one person but doesn't directly benefit the other. So, I've tried to focus on kind of those lenses I mentioned, because the first, I guess the unspoken first lens, or what I was thinking of as the first lens, same old, like, frankly, parent sob story. Like, yeah, childcare is super expensive. My wife and I were fortunate we can afford it, but it crushes us. We would be so much farther along with our goals and our finances if we weren't spending, somewhere around like $200,000 on this. But, like, who cares? It's my money, it's not yours. Like, frankly, do you really give a crap if I can't, like, put as much money in retirement as I want to? No, it doesn't matter to you. And that's why I think it's more important to focus on, like Janet was saying, larger impacts, even to people who are not directly impacted by that. So, equity, helping, the workforce be large enough to support the industries. Like, yeah, you care more about it if it's through that lens than if it's through the lens of like, man, Eli's paying a lot of money and he hates seeing that bill every month.
I think it's pretty hard to go too far without finding someone impacted by childcare. Maybe not your personal impact, but someone you know or someone you work with or someone who supports you in some way at the grocery store is impacted by childcare.
And you can grit your teeth and get through it, which I think is what a lot of parents do. So, it's kind of like you just close your eyes, write the check, and you're like, oh, we'll be in kindergarten soon, we'll be in kindergarten soon, we'll be in kindergarten soon. And I think, that approach is really common. That's what I've done.
Any other questions? Melissa? Oh, okay.
Hi, I'm Lois Collins from the Deseret News in Salt Lake City. So with a lot of public officials paying attention to fertility right now and worried about what that's going to do for the workforce, for schools, et cetera, has that helped at all? Because that seems like a window in to get people interested. The whole question, like the child tax credit, of helping make families affordable. Childcare is part of that. Has that helped?
I think it's a window in. And I think it's a window that's being used. I think it's wherever you are on the Roe v. Wade issues, It has leveraged some additional support for childcare. It ignites lots of feeling when it gets attached to those kinds of issues. But yes, I think we're beginning to see an impact and some increased attention on childcare from folks who would otherwise not have invested.
I would say yes, but I've also encountered plenty of people who are like, well, if it's so expensive, one parent should not work and you should have more kids that way. So, I've encountered both ways of thinking about it.
I will say, I should have said this, it was my last comment, but I just thought it was time to stop. For as long as I've been around, childcare is impacted by issues of isms, classism, sexism, sexism first, racism, and cultureism. And as so whenever we come upon the story, and you come upon the story, know that there is bias all around it. Bias that you mentioned, some bias that whether people are not should be having children, and if they have children, who should pay. Bias around who cares for children. Is that the mother's role? Should the mother stay at home? These are issues that impact every single reader who is reading an article about childcare. And it impacts the progress or lack of progress that we've made as a nation.
Alyssa Rosenberg in the Washington Post opinion section. You've mentioned a couple of times sort of making it possible for people to enter the labor force. Do you have a sense that there is kind of a subsidy threshold at which it becomes more affordable for people to work?
So what is that number? If you took 10% as a factor of gross household income, so if childcare is costing $15,000 or more a year for an infant, and 10% of a single parent household would have to be $150,000 in order for that to be 10%, right? So what is that threshold? Right now, subsidy pays in North Carolina, we pay up to 200% of poverty. We pay for childcare subsidy if your family is working, the parent is working, or in school, a combination of 30 hours or more per week. And we pay for childcare up to 200% of poverty, and what that number is varies based on your family size, of course. For a birth to 5-year-old child, and up to 133% of poverty for a school-age child. As wages are rising, that is becoming a lower and lower cutoff. Mecklenburg County has funded us to pay up to 300% of poverty. And there was discussion we've had about locally and elsewhere about going up to 400% of poverty. But some of this is guided really by federal legislation, by the rules and regulations around Child Care and Development Block Grant. So I don't have your absolute answer, Alyssa, sorry. But if you think of 10% as the high end of the threshold, and that's just for one child, then that's what we're probably talking about.
And I would just put some really simple math on that. If you have 2 kids under 3 here in Charlotte, you're probably going to be paying close to $30,000 a year for childcare. Does it make sense to enter the workforce for anything close to that? Or does it need to be substantially more in terms of the wages you're pursuing? So I look at it from that lens. And I'm from Silver Spring, right outside DC, and my friends there pay twice what I pay. So, it changes by region too.
Well, and here we're talking about choice, because your compensation, my compensation of my family structure affords me some choice. Talk about the single parent who really doesn't have that choice, and talk about the wages in childcare as an example of what low-wage earners are making. They don't have the choice. So really at that lower income threshold, low to middle income threshold, there is a national discussion about 7% of household income. Is it 10%? Is it 7%? We haven't decided. But I really worry about those of us who don't have choice. When I had young children, which was quite a while ago, I was married, and it was important for me to work for myself. But that was a privilege that I had. I didn't have to work, and I know I didn't earn anything when I had young children. I had so little take-home pay after the cost of childcare. But that's a person who has choice. What about the people who don't have choice?
Hi there, Michelle San Miguel with Rhode Island PBS. I'm curious if you know of any research that shows that people are choosing to have fewer children or choosing not to have children because of the high cost of childcare. Anecdotally, I know of cases, but I would imagine there's something out there.
There is, but I can't quote it right now. But if you give me your card, I will get it to you.
That was going to be my answer too. I've read those studies.
There is. I can't quote it right now.
Yeah.
And we all have anecdotes. We all have personal anecdotes that we can tell. But yes, there was a study done about population impact. And I'll just try and find it for you. I'm sorry, I don't have it off the top of my head.
Yeah.
We can take one more question probably, if there is one.
If there's not, I'll make a joke.
Okay.
All right. Well, my wife is from a big family, and I'm an only child, so we have 2 kids, and my wife's like, "Oh, I want 4." I'm like, "We can't. Cost of childcare." So, it is both true, but also in my personal life something that I can use as a sneaky way to keep the family the size I want it instead of the size my wife wants it. So.
The secret, the
She
secret's out.
will be once we post
The
it on.
secret's
Don't worry,
out.
don't worry.
For a small fee, I won't send her the link.
Where's that mic?
So, as we wind this session up, there are a couple of things I wanted to ask or put out there for both of you to consider, and that is, from my perspective, again, as somebody who began covering social policy affecting children and families in 1994 in Washington, the biggest challenge in issues like childcare and quality early education, et cetera, is that conservatives, whoever, have co-opted the language and have basically demonized poor people. And so issues like who takes care of our children, who educates our children, is cast in this sort of, if you're poor, you're too lazy to earn enough money to do this, you're immoral, you had these children out of wedlock, so you figure it out. I really feel like, given all of the conversations that we've had over the past couple of days about systemic barriers, this could probably be the number one issue in terms of how to get a family socially mobile, upwardly mobile rather, and get their children on the right path. If they don't have care, as a parent is struggling to work and do whatever they need to do, if there's no access to quality care, no access to education, safety for these young children, that's the key issue. I think that both of you would agree on
Yeah,
that.
and I see it in my own life. My kids, despite how expensive our childcare is, it is extremely high quality. My kids, 5 and 3, they know their letters. The 5-year-old's starting to read. They get all kinds of enrichment activities. They do art and dance and et cetera, et cetera. And on the days when one of them is sick and has to stay home, or when school is closed but work is still open, they're in front of the TV all day. And I'm like, yeah, if we were not able to afford childcare, we don't have access to family here to provide that, like, I get a window into what they would be doing without the high quality childcare that we're fortunate to have access to. And they will be at a massive advantage because of that. And that's just the truth.
Janet.
I guess I would say that some of our most effective early care and education strategy that reaches across the economic spectrum happens when we talk about universalism. We have created a universal pre-K system here in Charlotte without regard to income. We were able to do that because we struck a tone of universalism. And through that, as a strategy, a value, but also a strategy, we're able to leverage for those we might not have been able to leverage because of whatever bias exists about race or class or socioeconomic. I've said that, race or class. And so I think that's another lever to push. It's scary, but we're one of the only, if not the only industrialized nation without this kind of federal kind of child care policy and system. And so I think we leverage for those who have been marginalized, perhaps even more effectively when we use universalism as the construct for investment and attention. The research is clear. We've talked about labor force issues predominantly here. We've talked about how the system works or doesn't work for the families who rely on it and the employers who rely on it. We really haven't focused so much on the value of early learning to support the trajectory of success for the child, the adult that the child will become. That research is clear. How do we get folks invested in it? Because it's what we want for all of our children to thrive. So how do we help ensure that children have access to the resources and families that have access to the resources that thrive? If we won't make it available for one portion of our population, how do we make it available for all portions of our population? What is the promise of universalism? The price tag is huge, I get that. But what's the construct by which we build that support that isn't fractioned by the kind of biases that exist in our society?
And finally, remember the child care cliff. I think Janet's presentation truly helped me to contextualize and understand that we have a window of potential crisis coming up in all of the states when it comes to lack of access to those American Rescue Plan funds. And so please go back to your communities and take a look around and see how to communicate that. And in the meantime, let's thank both Eli Portillo and Janet Singerman for joining us this morning to discuss this issue. Thank you.
Thank you.